Hey guys, welcome back to the channel Historical Tales for Sleep. Close your eyes. Hear the plough damp with endless rain, the grumble of an empty stomach, the whisper of unseen taxes clawing at your thin bread. This was medieval farming, not just survival, but constant, crushing hardship, nature's wrath. The hungry earth imagined the ground refusing to birth grain. In 1315, relentless rain flooded fields, spoiled seeds, and starved livestock. Bread vanished from tables. Salt became pricier than gold. Peasants starved, even resorting to gathering barksome to the desperate edge of cannibalism. Nature's fury left survival hanging by a thinnest thread. Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, the Great Famine of 131-513-17, occasionally dated 1315 to 1322, was the first of a series of large-scale crises that struck parts of Europe early in the 14th century. Most of Europe extending east to Poland and south to the Alps was affected. The famine caused many deaths over an extended number of years and marked a clear end to the period of growth and prosperity from the Pierith to the 13th centuries. The Great Famine started with bad weather in spring 1315. Crop failures lasted through 1316 until the summer harvest in 1317, and Europe did not fully recover until 1322. Crop failures were not the only problem. Cattle disease caused sheep and cattle numbers to fall as much as 80%. The period was marked by extreme levels of crime, disease, mass death, and even cannibalism and infanticide. The crisis had consequences for the church, state, European society, and for future calamities to follow in the 14th century. Famines were familiar occurrences in medieval Europe. For example, localized famines occurred in the Kingdom of France during the 14th century in 1304, 1305, 1310, 1315 to 1317, the Great Famine, 1330 to 1334, 1349, 1351, 1358 to 1360, 1371, 1374 to 1375 and 1390 in the Kingdom of England, the most prosperous kingdom affected by the Great Famine. There were additional famines. In 1321, 1351 and 1369, according to official records about the English royal family, an example of the best off in society for whom records were kept. The average life expectancy at birth in 1276 was 35.28 years. Between 1301 and 1325, during the Great Famine, it was 29.84 years. But between 1348 and 1375, during the plague, it was only 17.33 years. The average life expectancy figures are skewed by child mortality rates, which were naturally high even during non-famine years. However, this demonstrates the steep population drop between 1348 and 1375 of about 42%. During the medieval, warm period 10th to 13th centuries, the population of Europe exploded compared to prior eras and reached levels that were not matched again. In some places until the 19th century, indeed, parts of rural France are still less populous than in the early 14th century. The yield ratios of wheat, the number of seeds one could harvest and consume per seed planted, had been dropping since 1280, and food prices had been increasing. After favorable harvests, the ratio could be as high as 7-to-1, but after unfavorable harvests, it was as low as 2-to-1, that is, for every seed planted, 2 seeds were harvested, 1 for next year's seed, and 1 for food. By comparison, modern farming has ratios of 30-to-1 or more. See agricultural productivity. The onset of the Great Famine followed the end of the medieval warm period. Between 1310 and 1330, Northern Europe saw some of the worst and most sustained periods of bad weather in the Middle Ages, characterized by severe winters and rainy and cold summers. The Great Famine may have been precipitated by a volcanic event and occurred during the Little Ice Age. Changing weather patterns, the ineffectiveness of medieval governments in dealing with crises, and population level at a historical high made it a time with little margin for error in food production. Great Famine in the spring of 1315. Unusually heavy rain began in much of Europe. Throughout the spring and the summer, it continued to rain, and the temperature remained cool. Under such conditions, grain could not ripen, leading to widespread crop failures. Grains were brought indoors in urns and pots to keep dry. The straw and hay for the animals could not be cured, so there was no fodder for the livestock. The soil became extremely moist from the heavy rain, making it impossible to plough the fields ready for planting. In England, lowlands in Yorkshire and Nottingham were flooded, while stew ponds on the River Foss in Yorkshire were washed away. The price of food began to rise. Prices in England doubled between spring and midsummer. Salt, the only way to cure and preserve meat, was difficult to obtain because brine could not be effectively evaporated in wet weather. As a result, its price increased from 30 to 40 shillings. In Lorraine, wheat prices rose by 320%, making bread unaffordable to peasants. Stores of grain for long-term emergencies were limited to royalty, lords, nobles, wealthy merchants, and the church. Because of the general increased population pressures, even lower than average harvests meant some people would go hungry. There was little margin for failure. People began to harvest wild edible roots, grasses, nuts, and bark in the forests. A number of documented incidents show the extent of the famine. Edward II of England stopped at St. Albans on 10 August 1315 and had difficulty finding bread for himself and his entourage. It was a rare occasion in which the King of England was unable to eat. In Bristol, the city's chronicles reported that in 1315 there was a great famine of dearth, with such mortality that the living could scarce suffice to bury the dead. Horse flesh and dog's flesh was accounted good meat, and some eat their own children. The thieves that were in prison did pluck and tear in pieces such as were newly put into prison, and devoured them half alive. The French, under Louis X, tried to invade Flanders, but in low-lying areas of the Netherlands, the fields were soaked and the army became bogged down and were forced to retreat, burning their provisions where they abandoned them, unable to carry them away. In spring 1316, it continued to rain on a European population deprived of energy and reserves to sustain itself. All segments of society, from nobles to peasants, were affected, but especially the peasants, who represented 95% of the population and who had no reserve food supplies to provide some measure of relief. The future was mortgaged by slaughtering the draft animals, eating the seed grain, abandoning children to fend for themselves. See Hansel and Gretel and WNs among old people. Voluntary starvation so that the younger generation could continue to work the fields. The chroniclers of the time noted many incidents of cannibalism. It was reported that during the famine, people would open the graves of the newly dead and claim them as food, though one can never tell if such talk was not simply a matter of rumor-mongering. As Lynn H. Nelson comments, the height of the famine was in 1317, as the wet weather continued. In that summer, the weather returned to normal patterns. By then, people were so weakened by diseases such as pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis, and so much of the seed stock had been eaten that it was not until 1325 that the food supply returned to relatively normal levels and the population began to increase. Historians debate the toll, but it is estimated that 10 to 25% of the population of many cities and towns died. Though the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, would kill more people, it often swept through an area in a matter of months, whereas the Great Famine lingered for years, prolonging the suffering of the populace. Jean-Pierre Leguet noted the Great Famine produced wholesale slaughter in a world that was already overcrowded, especially in the towns, which were natural outlets for rural overpopulation. Estimates of death rates vary by place, but some examples include a loss of 10 to 15% in the south of England. Northern France lost about 10% of its population geographically and hydroclimate context. The Great Famine was restricted to northern Europe, including the British Isles, northern France, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, Germany, and western Poland. It also affected some of the Baltic states, except for the far eastern Baltic, which was affected only indirectly. The famine was bounded to the south by the Alps and the Pyrenees. The 1314 to 1316 period was the fifth wettest 3-year interval in Europe from 1300 to 2012. Of the 4 wetter periods, 3 occurred after 1710, when agricultural technology was much more productive, while 1 occurred after the Black Death, when population size had already been reduced. The Great Famine's exceptional severity was due to extreme precipitation, coinciding with peak medieval population and pre-industrial agriculture, creating an extreme vulnerability to sustained adverse weather consequences. The Great Famine is noteworthy for the number of people who died, the vast geographic area that was affected, its length, and its lasting consequences. Nearly all human societies at this time attributed natural disasters as being divine retribution for their apparent misdeeds. In a society whose final recourse for nearly all problems had been religion, and Roman Catholicism was the only tolerated Christian faith, no amount of prayer seemed effective against the root causes of the famine. Thus, the famine undermined the institutional authority of the Roman Catholic Church, and helped lay the foundations for later movements that were deemed heretical by the Roman Catholic Church, as they opposed the papacy and blamed the perceived failure of prayer upon corruption and doctrinal errors within the Roman Catholic Church. Cultural medieval Europe in the 14th century had already experienced widespread social violence, and even acts then punishable by death such as rape and murder were demonstrably far more common, especially relative to the population size. Compared with modern times, the famine led to a stark increase in crime, even among those not normally inclined to criminal activity, because people would resort to any means to feed themselves or their families. For the next several decades after the famine, Europe took on a tougher and more violent edge. It became an even less amicable place than during the 12th and the 13th centuries. This could be seen across all segments of society, perhaps most strikingly in the way warfare was conducted in the 14th century during the 100 Years' War, when chivalry ended, as opposed to the 12th and the 13th centuries, when nobles were more likely to die by accident in tournament games than on the field of battle. The famine undermined confidence in medieval governments due to their failure to deal with its resulting crises. This had particularly dire consequences for Edward II of England, who was already an unpopular monarch. While the famine was seen as divine retribution both in England and on the continent, The English were more inclined to blame their misfortune on the perceived misrule and immorality of the king as opposed to alleged misconduct within the church. This contributed to his downfall in 1327. The back-breaking grind of peasant life before dawn's first light. Farmers rose to toil. Fields demanded hours of ploughing, sowing, and harvesting using rudimentary tools. Harsh diets and fragile homes meant fatigue was constant company. Most peasants never lived past 40 each day was survival, not life. Life of a medieval peasant. What was daily life really like? Discover what life was really like for a medieval peasant. It wasn't just about hard work, it was also about daily life, family, and faith. How did they live in villages? What did they eat? What did they believe in? Learn about the feudal system, everyday struggles, homes, holidays, and the rights of the people. Step into the world of the people who were the backbone of the Middle Ages and uncover the truth behind the myths. Introduction. Who were the medieval peasants? Imagine medieval society. What comes to mind first? Knights in shining armor, powerful kings in grand castles, or monks in quiet monasteries. But the real foundation of all that splendor and of life itself in those distant times was something else entirely. It was the peasants, the people who worked the land with their hands, feeding the cities, armies, and noble courts. Without their daily, often unseen labor, the whole feudal system would have collapsed. But who were they? Let's take a closer look and set aside some common/myths. Myths. Medieval society is often described as a pyramid, or divided into 3 estates. Those who fight lords and knights, those who pray the clergy, and those who work the peasants. Peasants made up the vast majority of the population by some estimates, between 80% and 90%. Their primary role, or duty, in the feudal system was farming. They worked the land, either their own if they were free, or the lord's land if they were serfs or bound peasants, in return for the right to live on the lord's land, graze animals on shared pastures, or use the lord's mill to grind grain. Peasants had to pay. They paid in goods, a portion of their crops, livestock, or handmade items, and often even harder, with labor. That meant working a certain number of days on the lord's fields, known as corvée, or forced labor. This give and take, land and protection from the lord, in exchange for the peasant's work and part of the harvest, was the core of feudalism. Here's an important point that people often miss. The life of a medieval peasant wasn't just endless suffering and misery. Yes, it was hard, full of labor, and dependent on the weather and the will of the Lord. But not all peasants were equally powerless. There were free peasants called villeins who had more rights. They could leave their lord, sell their land, and their duties were clearly defined and limited. Serfs, on the other hand, lived under much stricter conditions. They were tied to the land and their lord. Their obligations were often heavier and less flexible. Wealth also varied a lot. Some peasants had a sturdy house, a cow, and a few sheep. Others barely survived. One year could bring hardship after a harsh winter or a bad harvest. Hunger was real. But there were also times of relative plenty, especially after a good harvest. Understanding this variety is key to seeing the real picture of medieval peasants, not just as a nameless, oppressed crowd, but as real people. They had families, worries, joys, and their social hierarchy. They were the ones who held up the entire world of the Middle Ages. Daily routine, work, food, and family life. Imagine the sound of a bell ringing at dawn, not a church bell, but the one calling people to work. The life of a medieval peasant followed the rhythm of the sun and the seasons. In summer, they got up long before sunrise. In winter, a bit later, but always with the first rooster's crow. How did their day begin? Not with a slow, peaceful breakfast. The first task was the animals. They had to milk the cow, if they were lucky enough to have one, let out the sheep and chickens, and feed the pigs. Only after that could the family gather around the hearth for a simple meal, a piece of yesterday's bread, maybe some onion or turnip, and the main morning drink ale. Don't be surprised, beer back then was much weaker and more nutritious than today, and everyone drank it, even children, because clean water was often hard to find. The heart of a peasant's day was hard, farm work. For most of the year, men, women, and even older children went out to the fields. In spring, they ploughed and planted rye, barley, oats, and peas. Summer meant weeding and cutting hay. Autumn was harvest time, the busiest season, when people worked from sunrise to sunset, afraid of rain or early frost. Every minute of daylight counted. Besides working on the Lord's land as part of their forced labor, peasants also had to tend their small plots. Their families' survival in winter depended on that harvest. Women, in addition to field work, had a huge load of house duties: cooking, spinning wool or flax, weaving, taking care of the garden cabbage, beans, onions, garlic, watching the children, and collecting herbs and berries in the forest. Children began helping from a young age, often around 7 or 8. They would herd geese or sheep, gather firewood, watch their younger siblings, and help weed the garden beds. A peasant's food was simple, seasonal, and depended heavily on the harvest. The main part of their diet was bread, usually coarse, made from rye or barley. The most common dish was a thick stew or porridge called pottage that simmered over the fire all day, sometimes for several days in a row. It included whatever was available: crushed grains, beans, cabbage, turnips, onions, and sometimes bits of fat, or, if they were lucky, some salted meat. Meat, like pork, mutton, or more rarely beef, wasn't eaten often, usually only on holidays, or after animals were slaughtered in autumn. Fish, especially freshwater fish, were more common. In summer and fall, their meals were enriched with garden vegetables, wild berries, mushrooms, and nuts from the forest. Sugar was a luxury, so sweet things meant honey if they kept bees or dried fruits. Dinner was usually even simpler than breakfast, and after eating, the family went to sleep soon after dark, saving firewood and candles. Work, food, sleep. That was the simple, labor-filled rhythm of daily life for medieval peasants. Homes and villages. How and where did they live? Imagine not a single farm far away, but a close-knit web of houses, roads, and fields. A medieval village. It wasn't just a group of huts. It was a living, breathing community, the center of the world for a peasant. Medieval peasant houses were very simple by today's standards. They were built from whatever nature nearby provided materials that were easy to find and free to use. The most common type of home was a one-story building with a frame made of oak or ash beams. The spaces between the beams were filled with woven twigs coated in a mixture of clay, manure, and straw. This was called wattle and daub. The roof was steep, so snow and rain would slide off easily, and it was covered with straw or red. In forested areas, they might use wooden shingles. Windows were tiny and often had no glass because glass was expensive. Instead, they were covered with wooden shutters or stretched animal bladders treated with oil. Doors were low, not just to keep out the heat, but also to make anyone entering bow or even bump their head. Inside the house, there was just one big room. This was where the family lived, ate, slept, worked, and even kept newborn animals during winter for warmth and safety. The heart of the room was an open hearth in the center. Smoke rose under the roof and slowly filtered through the straw, which is why their clothes and hair always smelled smoky. There was little furniture, a rough table, benches along the walls, and a chest for valuables. People usually slept on benches or straw-stuffed mattresses right there in the same room. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with a layer of reeds. What was it, cramped? Yes, smoky, very much so. But it was there, warm, humble shelter. The village itself was carefully planned to help the community survive. Usually, a church stood in the center, not just a spiritual place, but a social hub too. Nearby was the village square, or a green meadow where people held meetings, celebrations, and sometimes sold goods at a small market. There was always a communal bakery. Baking bread was a complex task, so not every house had its oven and often a blacksmith's workshop. Peasant houses stood fairly close together along unpaved streets or around the square. Right behind the houses were gardens where families grew vegetables, herbs, and fruit trees. Beyond the gardens stretched large fields, divided into narrow strips shared between families in the community. This was called the open field system. There were also common lands, meadows for grazing animals, pasture, forests where people collected firewood, berries, mushrooms, and grazed, pigs, and sometimes a pond or a stream. Community life was the foundation of everything. Peasants were connected not only by the Lord's land, but also by a system of mutual responsibility within the village. They decided together when and what to plant, how to divide the strips of land in the fields, and when to start the harvest. They chose a village elder, usually one of the wealthier farmers, to represent them to the Lord or his steward, helping neighbors in trouble. Working together for the village's benefit, like cleaning ditches or fixing bridges, and making sure everyone followed the village rules. All this created a strong web of dependence. Living alone back then was simply impossible. The village was their world, their protection, and their main community. Faith, festivals, and beliefs. If a peasant's work fed the body, then faith was food for the soul and their main guide in an unpredictable world. Religion in the Middle Ages touched almost every part of daily life. The church bell marked not only prayer times, but also the start of work, the lunch break, and the end of the workday. Sunday was sacred, officially. No work was allowed except the most urgent tasks, like feeding the animals. The whole village gathered for Mass. This wasn't just a religious service. It was the most important social event of the week. People shared news, made plans, showed off new clothes, even if simple, and young people looked for potential partners. The priest, often coming from a peasant background himself, and not always highly educated, was a key figure. He baptized, married, held funerals, gave advice, sometimes even medical, and acted as a go-between for the village and the Lord. But the church calendar gave more than just duties. It also brought much-needed breaks, filled with festivals and celebrations. The year was divided into cycles marked by medieval holidays, many of which had deep pre-Christian roots but were renamed for saints. The winter holidays from Christmas to Epiphany were a time of caroling, dressing up in costumes, plenty of food as much as the stores allowed, games, and fortune-telling. Maslenitsa, before Lent, was about pancakes, fun, and burning an effigy of winter. Easter was the most important Christian holiday, marking rebirth with food blessings, games like rolling eggs, and hope for a good harvest. May Day welcomed spring, with homes decorated with greenery, the crowning of the May Queen, and circle dances. The summer solstice included bonfires, jumping over fire, searching for the mythical fern flower, bathing, and gathering healing herbs. Finally, the harvest festival held on different days at the end of summer or fall was a time to give thanks for the bread, enjoy pies made from the new grain, and take part in fairs. Why were these holidays so important? They were more than just entertainment. They gave structure to the year, offering breaks from exhausting work, bringing the community together, and letting people release stress. These moments of joy and unity, even if brief, meant a lot to everyone. Beneath the surface of official Christianity, a strong layer of folk beliefs and superstitions bubbled among peasants. The medieval peasants' world was filled not only with saints, but also with spirits, house guardians, forest spirits, water beings, mermaids, witches, and evil forces. Peasant beliefs came with many rules and taboos. Don't whistle inside the house or money will leave. Spilling salt meant a quarrel. Knocking on wood protected against the evil eye. Spells and charms were used to protect from illness, bad luck, sick animals, and failed harvests. Healers and fortune tellers, often older women, were respected for their skills in stopping bleeding. Using herbs or warding off storms, people feared the evil eye and believed in signs, like the owl's cry predicting trouble or the cuckoo's call telling how many years one would live. They especially honored blessed places, springs, stones, and old trees. This mix of Christianity and pagan beliefs wasn't a contradiction, but a curious blend that helped explain the unexplainable, protect from evil, and find some support in a dangerous world. Faith, both church and folk, was a real, everyday part of their lives, just as real as the weight of a hoe in their hands or the smell of fresh-baked bread. Hardships and rights, what challenges did they face? The life of a medieval peasant, even in relatively peaceful times, was a constant balancing act. Hardships and duties weighed heavily on their shoulders, often unfairly. The main source of pressure was the feudal system itself and its demands. Labor duties, corvée, lay. The most hated obligation for many peasants was corvée, the required number of days, often 2 to 3 or even more per week, that they had to work for free on the Lord's land. Ploughing, planting, harvesting, cutting hay, fixing roads, or strengthening the castle walls. All this took time away from their fields during the busiest season. The Lord Steward closely watched the quality and amount of this work. Payments in goods and money. Even after working their corvée, peasants were not free. They paid a tithe to the church, usually 1/10 of their crops or livestock, a required payment that was not always fair. To the Lord, they paid a tallage, a money tax that could be raised at will, and a ching, a fixed fee for using the land. On top of that, there were many small charges for grinding grain at the Lord's mill, often a monopoly, for baking bread in the communal oven, for crossing the Lord's bridge, and for grazing pigs in the Lord's forest. Gut, a daughter's wedding. Pay a ransom to the Lord. Father died. Pay an inheritance tax. Personal unfreedom of serfs. For serfs, the burden was even heavier. They couldn't leave their Lord without permission, couldn't marry freely, they needed the Lord's consent, and often had to pay a fee, and couldn't even sell their only cow without his approval. They were considered part of the Lord's property, tied to the land, vulnerability to the forces of nature and society. The peasant was defenseless in the face of crises, poor harvests and famine. 2 or 3 bad harvests in a row could plunge the whole village into hunger. Food stores ran out, and bread prices soared. People ate roots, tree bark, and carrion. Death rates rose sharply, especially among children and the elderly. Diseases, poor sanitation, overcrowding, and malnutrition made peasants easy victims for epidemics. The plague, the Black Death, in the 14th century wiped out up to a third of Europe's population. Smallpox, dysentery, and tuberculosis killed entire families. Medicine was primitive and hard to access. War, an army passing through, even if it was their own, was a disaster. Soldiers took food and livestock by force, burned homes and crops, robbed, raped, and killed. War turned peasants into helpless victims. Was their hope. Rights and resistance. Despite everything, peasants were not completely powerless slaves. Free peasants' villains had clearly defined rights and duties written down in village charters. They could go to court, although justice for peasants was rare. Even serfs had the right to their land and the lord's protection from outside threats. Even if mostly symbolic, the main support was the community, which could negotiate together with the lord or his steward to defend their interests. And when the pressure became unbearable, revolts broke out. The most famous was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, led by Wat Tyler. Peasants angry about a new poll tax and growing efforts to tie them to the land, marched on London, demanding the end of serfdom and lower taxes. Although the revolt was brutally crushed and its leaders executed, it showed that peasant patience had limits, and it made many lords think twice. The life of a medieval peasant is not just a story of hard labor and hardship. It's also a story of endurance, deep connection to the land, community, strength, and rare but bold attempts to seek justice in an unjust world. Dietary habits of medieval peasants. Medieval food has long been a source of fascination for scholars and enthusiasts alike. While the era was marked by high levels of poverty and subsistence living, it was also a time of rich culinary traditions and hearty peasant meals. In this article, we will explore the dietary habits of medieval peasants and gain insight into the foods that sustained them. Introduction to medieval peasant diets. When it comes to medieval food, the diet of peasants is an area of particular interest. Peasant meals were often simple, yet filling, and consisted of staple foods such as grains, legumes, and root vegetables. However, the availability of certain foods, as well as socio-economic factors, played a significant role in shaping their diet. In this section, we will explore the historical context of medieval peasant diets and the factors that influenced their food choices. Factors that shaped peasant diets. The availability of food was a crucial factor in shaping the diets of medieval peasants. This was largely dependent on the region in which they lived and the season. For example, those living in coastal areas had access to seafood, while those living inland relied more heavily on meat and dairy products. Another factor that influenced peasant diets was socio-economic status. Peasants were at the bottom rung of the social ladder and often had limited access to a varied diet. Wealthier peasants had slightly more access to meat and dairy products, while the poorest relied mainly on grains, legumes, and vegetables. Religion also played a role in shaping peasant diets. Many religious festivals and holy days required fasting or the consumption of certain foods, which impacted the regular diet of medieval peasants. Despite these limitations, medieval peasants were resourceful in making the most out of the foods available to them. They used a variety of cooking techniques, such as open fire cooking, stewing, and baking, to prepare their meals. These foods were abundant and relatively affordable for the peasant class. Bread, made from the aforementioned grains, was a staple at every meal and often used as a utensil for eating other foods. Porridge, made from grains and water, was another common dish. Legumes, such as lentils and beans, were often used as a substitute for meat due to their high protein content. They were also used to thicken stews and soups, as well as to make vegetarian dishes. Root vegetables provided important vitamins and minerals, such as vitamin C and potassium. They were often used in soups and stews, and occasionally roasted or boiled as a side dish. Overall, the use of these staple foods in the peasant diet allowed for a relatively balanced and sustainable diet. Despite its lack of variety, daily meals and eating patterns, medieval peasants typically had 2 meals a day, one in the late morning and the other in the evening. Breakfast is not a meal that was common in the medieval period. The morning meal usually consisted of a simple porridge made from grains like barley, oats, or rye. In some regions, peasants also ate bread with cheese or butter during this meal. The evening meal was the main meal of the day and was more substantial. It usually included a stew made from beans or vegetables, with some meat or fish added on special occasions. Potatoes, which were introduced to Europe after the medieval period, were not available to peasants. As a result, root vegetables, such as turnips and onions, were used as a substitute. Communal dining was a common practice among peasants, with several families gathering together to share meals. This allowed them to pool resources and socialize while enjoying a hot meal. Trestle tables were set up in the middle of the room, and everyone sat on benches or stools around them. Food rations. Peasants had to work hard for their meals. They were often given food rations as part of their wages, which usually consisted of a specific amount of grain, beans, or bread. In some cases, they were given a small amount of meat or fish. These rations were often meager, and peasants had to supplement their diets by foraging for wild berries and nuts. Overall, the dietary habits of medieval peasants were largely determined by socio-economic factors such as their social class, geographical location, and the availability of food. Despite the challenges they faced, peasants were resourceful and managed to sustain themselves on a relatively simple yet nutritious diet. Protein. Sources in the peasant diet. Protein was an essential component of the medieval peasant diet, and it was obtained from various sources depending on availability and affordability. Meat was a luxury that only the wealthiest could afford, but peasants could occasionally access wild game, rabbits, or fowl through poaching or hunting. Eggs were also a popular protein source, and they were often consumed boiled, fried, or incorporated into dishes such as stews and pies. Dairy products such as cheese, butter, and milk were common sources of protein, especially in areas where cattle were prevalent. In addition, peas, beans, and lentils were staple protein sources for medieval peasants and were often used to supplement meat, or used in vegetarian dishes such as porridges and soups. The role of fish in the peasant diet. Fish was another important protein source in the medieval peasant diet, especially for those living near rivers or coastal areas. However, the consumption of fish was often restricted by religious fasting practices, which limited the intake of meat during Lent and other religious observances. To supplement their protein intake during times of fasting, peasants often relied on other sources such as dairy products, eggs, and vegetables. Overall, the availability and affordability of protein sources for medieval peasants varied greatly by region, social class, and time of year. Despite these challenges, peasants were able to adapt their diets and obtain the necessary nutrients for survival and daily sustenance. Seasonal and regional variation in peasant diets. Medieval peasant diets were heavily influenced by seasonal and regional factors. The availability of certain foods varied throughout the year and depending on the location, which affected what peasants were able to grow and consume. Seasonal variation in the summer months, peasants had access to a wider variety of fresh fruits and vegetables such as peas, beans, berries, and apples. However, in the winter, fresh produce was scarce, and peasants relied more heavily on preserved foods like salted meat and pickled vegetables. Additionally, during the Lenten season leading up to Easter, meat was often prohibited, which meant that peasants had to find alternative sources of protein such as fish, dairy products, and eggs. Regional variation, the availability of certain foods, also varied depending on the region in which peasants lived. Coastal areas had access to more seafood, while inland regions relied more on dairy products and grains. The diets of peasants in southern Europe were influenced by Mediterranean cuisine and incorporated more herbs and spices, while those in northern Europe had more of a focus on preserved foods and hearty stews. Peasants in areas with fertile soil were able to grow a wider variety of crops, while those in mountainous regions had to rely more on foraging for wild foods. Overall, the diets of medieval peasants were highly dependent on the season and region in which they lived. However, despite these limitations, peasants were still able to create flavorful and nutritious meals with the ingredients available to them. Cooking methods and techniques. The cooking methods and techniques used by medieval peasants were simple but effective, relying heavily on open-fire cooking and stewing. These methods allowed them to cook food over an open flame or in a pot with a little water, making the most of their limited resources. Open-fire cooking. Medieval peasants would often cook their food over an open flame, either outside or in a central hearth within their homes. This method involved placing the food on skewers or directly on the fire, roasting it until it was cooked through. Stewing. Another common cooking method was stewing, which involved cooking meat and vegetables in a pot with a small amount of water or broth. This allowed the ingredients to cook slowly, resulting in a flavorsome and tender dish. Baking. Baking was also used by medieval peasants, although it was less common due to the limited availability of ovens. When they did bake, it was often bread made from a mixture of grains. Spit roasting. Spit roasting was used on occasion for larger animals, such as pigs or cattle. The animal would be impaled on a spit and slow roasted over an open fire. The resourcefulness and creativity of medieval cooking methods and techniques have been passed down from generation to generation. Even today, many traditional dishes are prepared using these methods. Beverages in the peasant diet in addition to water. Medieval peasants consumed a variety of beverages as part of their daily diet. Ale was a popular drink among the peasantry, as it was relatively easy and inexpensive to produce. Made from fermented grains and flavored with various herbs, ale was a staple of the medieval diet and was consumed both as a source of hydration and as a form of social lubricant. Wine, on the other hand, was a much rarer commodity for medieval peasants, reserved mostly for the nobility and the clergy. However, some regions of Europe had a tradition of winemaking that extended to the lower classes, and in those areas, peasants might be able to enjoy a glass of their own locally produced wine from time to time. Ale was a popular drink among the peasantry, as it was relatively easy and inexpensive to produce. Besides alcoholic drinks, medieval peasants also consumed a variety of non-alcoholic beverages, such as milk and buttermilk. Milk was a primary source of nutrition for children, while buttermilk was a byproduct of butter making that could be used in cooking or consumed as a beverage. Peasants also drank a variety of herbal teas made from plants like chamomile, mint, and nettle, which were believed to have medicinal properties. The importance of ale was a crucial part of the medieval peasant diet, not only for its hydration benefits, but also because it provided a significant source of calories and nutrients. In fact, in some cases, ale might have made up as much as 1/3 of a peasant's daily caloric intake. Furthermore, ale was typically brewed with a variety of grains and herbs that could provide additional nutrients beyond those found in staple foods, like bread and porridge. However, excessive consumption of ale could also have negative health consequences for medieval peasants. Heavy drinking could result in chronic liver disease, heart failure, and other ailments. While the alcohol content of ale could impair cognitive function and lead to accidents or injuries, ale was a crucial part of the medieval peasant diet, not only for its hydration benefits, but also because it provided a significant source of calories and nutrients. Despite these risks, ale remained a popular and important part of medieval peasant culture, with communal brewing and drinking playing a significant role in socializing and community building among the lower classes. Dietary restrictions and challenges, the availability of a variety of foods. Medieval peasants faced several dietary restrictions and challenges that affected their meals. These limitations were often due to their social class, religion, or geography. Social class-based limitations. Peasants were at the bottom rung of the feudal system and had limited access to certain types of food. Meat, for example, was a luxury reserved for the nobility and the clergy, and peasants could only consume it on special occasions such as feast days. Similarly, some exotic food items, such as spices or sugar, were out of reach for most peasants due to their high cost. Religious fasting. The medieval period was deeply religious, and fasting was an important practice for Christians. Both the Catholic and Orthodox churches had numerous fasting days throughout the year when meat, dairy products, and eggs were not allowed. Peasants had to rely on other sources of protein, such as fish, legumes, and vegetables. During these periods, geographical limitations. Peasants living in different regions had varying access to certain food items. Those who lived near the coast had a greater abundance of fish, while those in inland regions had to rely more on grains and vegetables. Additionally, seasonal variation affected the availability of certain fruits and vegetables, making it challenging for peasants to maintain a varied diet throughout the year. Despite these restrictions and challenges, medieval peasants found ways to adapt and make the most of the food available to them. Their diet may have been simple, but it provided the necessary nutrients for them to survive and thrive in their daily lives. In conclusion, the dietary habits of medieval peasants were shaped by a complex interplay of socio-economic factors and environmental conditions. Despite facing numerous challenges, such as limited access to certain foods and dietary restrictions, medieval peasants developed a cuisine that was both diverse and nutritious. The staple foods of their diet, including grains, legumes, and root vegetables, formed the foundation of their meals and provided a sustainable source of energy. Protein sources such as dairy products, eggs, and occasionally meat were consumed in smaller quantities. Seasonal and regional variation played a significant role in the diet of medieval peasants, with certain foods being more readily available during specific times of the year or in particular geographical locations. Cooking methods such as open fire cooking, stewing, and baking were employed to prepare meals, while water, ale, and occasionally wine were consumed as the main beverages. Despite the challenges faced by medieval peasants, Their diet was a reflection of their resilience and resourcefulness. By making the most of what was available to them, medieval peasants developed a cuisine that was not only unique but also sustainable. Today, the legacy of medieval peasant diets can be seen in many traditional dishes, and it serves as a reminder of the importance of eating locally and seasonally. So, next time you're enjoying a hearty stew or a loaf of bread, take a moment to appreciate the ingenuity and resourcefulness of medieval peasants. Their diet may have been humble, but it was also a testament to their strength and perseverance in the face of adversity. Trapped by feudal chains, evil customs, freedom was myth. Lords imposed evil customs. Visiting bakeries, mills, even marriages required payment. These hidden taxes drained families. Dry farming wasn't just exhausting, it was financially enslaving. Peasant. A peasant is a pre-industrial agricultural laborer or a farmer with limited land ownership, especially one living in the Middle Ages under feudalism and paying rent, tax, fees, or services to a landlord in Europe. Three classes of peasants existed: non-free slaves, semi-free serfs, and free tenants. Peasants might hold title to land outright fee simple, or by any of several forms of land tenure, among them socage, quitrent, leasehold, and copyhold. In some contexts, peasant has a pejorative meaning, even when referring to farm laborers. As early as in 13th century Germany, the concept of peasant could imply rustic as well as robber, as the English term villain. In 21st century English, the word peasant can mean an ignorant, rude, or unsophisticated person. The word rose to renewed popularity in the 1940s, 1960s as a collective term, often referring to rural populations of developing countries in general, as the semantic successor to native, incorporating all its condescending and racial overtones. The word peasantry is commonly used in a non-pejorative sense as a collective noun for the rural population in the poor and developing countries of the world. Citation needed via Campesina, an organization claiming to represent the rights of about 200 million farm workers around the world, self-defines as an international peasants' movement as of 2019. The United Nations and its Human Rights Council prominently uses the term peasant in a non-pejorative sense, as in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, adopted in 2018. In general, English language, literature, the use of the word peasant has steadily declined since about 1970. Etymology: the word peasant is derived from the 15th century French word paysant, meaning one from the pays or countryside, ultimately from the Latin pagus, or outlying administrative district, social position. Peasants typically made up the majority of the agricultural labor force in a pre-industrial society. The majority of the people, according to one estimate, 85% of the population in the Middle Ages, were peasants. Though peasant is a word of loose application, once a market economy had taken root, the term peasant proprietors was frequently used to describe the traditional rural population in countries where smallholders farmed much of the land. More generally, the word peasant is sometimes used to refer pejoratively to those considered to be lower class, perhaps defined by poorer education and/or a lower income. Medieval European peasants. The open field system of agriculture dominated most of Europe during medieval times and endured until the 19th century in many areas. Under this system, peasants lived on a manor presided over by a lord or a bishop of the church. Peasants paid rent or labor services to the lord in exchange for their right to cultivate the land. Fallowed land, pastures, forests, and wasteland were held in common. The open field system required cooperation among the peasants of the manor. It was gradually replaced by individual ownership and management of land. The relative position of peasants in Western Europe improved greatly after the Black Death had reduced the population of medieval Europe in the mid-14th century, resulting in more land for the survivors and making labor more scarce. In the wake of this disruption to the established order, it became more productive for many laborers to demand wages and other alternative forms of compensation, which ultimately led to the development of widespread literacy and the enormous social and intellectual changes of the Enlightenment. The evolution of ideas in an environment of relatively widespread literacy laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution, which enabled mechanically and chemically augmented agricultural production while simultaneously increasing the demand for factory workers in cities, who became what Karl Marx called the proletariat. The trend toward individual ownership of land, typified in England by enclosure, displaced many peasants from the land and compelled them, often unwillingly, to become urban factory workers, who came to occupy the socio-economic stratum, formerly the preserve of the medieval peasants. This process happened in an especially pronounced and truncated way in Eastern Europe. Lacking any catalysts for change in the 14th century, Eastern European peasants, largely, continued upon the original medieval path until the 18th and 19th centuries. Serfdom was abolished in Russia in 1861, and while many peasants would remain in areas where their family had farmed for generations, the changes did allow for the buying and selling of lands traditionally held by peasants, and for landless ex-peasants to move to the cities. Even before emancipation in 1861, serfdom was on the wane in Russia. The proportion of serfs within the empire had gradually decreased, from 45 to 50% at the end of the 18th century, to 37.7% in 1858. Early modern Germany. In Germany, peasants continued to center their lives in the village well into the 19th century. They belonged to a corporate body and helped to manage the community resources and to monitor community life. In the East, they had the status of serfs bound permanently to parcels of land. A peasant is called a Bauer in German and Bauer in Low German, pronounced in English like Bauer in most of Germany. Farming was handled by tenant farmers who paid rents and obligatory services to the landlord, typically a nobleman. Peasant leaders supervised the fields and ditches and grazing rights, maintained public order and morals, and supported a village court which handled minor offences. Inside the family, the patriarch made all the decisions and tried to arrange advantageous marriages for his children. Much of the village's communal life centered on church services and holy days. In Prussia, the peasants drew lots to choose conscripts required by the army. The noblemen handled external relationships and politics for the villagers under their control, and were not typically involved in daily activities or decisions. France. Information about the complexities of the French Revolution, especially the fast-changing scene in Paris, reached isolated areas through both official announcements and long-established oral networks. Peasants responded differently to different sources of information. The limits on political knowledge in these areas depended more on how much peasants chose to know than on bad roads or illiteracy. Historian Jill Masiak concludes that peasants were neither subservient, reactionary, nor ignorant in his seminal book Peasants into Frenchmen, The Modernization of Rural France, 1880 to 1914-1976. Historian Eugene Weber traced the modernization of French villages and argued that rural France went from backward and isolated to modern and possessing a sense of French nationhood. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, he emphasized the roles of railroads, republican schools, and universal military conscription. He based his findings on school records, migration patterns, military service documents, and economic trends. Weber argued that until 1900 or so, a sense of French nationhood was weak in the provinces. Weber then looked at how the policies of the Third Republic created a sense of French nationality in rural areas. The book was widely praised, but some argued that a sense of Frenchness existed in the provinces. Before 1870, Chinese farmers in China have been sometimes referred to as peasants in English language sources. However, the traditional term for farmer, nonfu, simply refers to farmer or agricultural worker. In the 19th century, Japanese intellectuals reinvented the Chinese terms Fenjian, Fungjen for feudalism and Normin, or farming people. Terms used in the description of feudal Japanese society. These terms created a negative image of Chinese farmers by making a class distinction where one had not previously existed. Anthropologist Myron Cohen considers these terms to be neologisms that represented a cultural and political invention. He writes, "This divide represented a radical departure from tradition. F.W. Mote and others have shown how, especially during the later imperial era Ming and Qing dynasties, China was notable for the cultural, social, political, and economic interpenetration of city and countryside. But the term non-Min did enter China in association with Marxist and non-Marxist Western perceptions of the peasant, thereby putting the full weight of the Western heritage to use in a new and sometimes harshly negative representation of China's rural population. Likewise, with this development, Westerners found it all the more natural to apply their own historically derived images of the peasant to what they observed or were told in China. The idea of the peasant remains powerfully entrenched in the Western perception of China to this very day. Writers in English mostly used the term farmers until the 1920s, when the term peasant came to predominate, implying that China was feudal, ready for revolution, like Europe before the French Revolution. This Western use of the term suggests that China is stagnant, medieval, underdeveloped, and held back by its rural population. Cohen writes that the imposition of the historically burdened Western contrasts of town and country, shopkeeper and peasant, or merchant and landlord, serves only to distort the realities of the Chinese economic tradition. Latin American farmers in Latin America. The term peasant is translated to campesino from campo country person, but the meaning has changed over time. While most campesinos before the 20th century were in equivalent status to peasants, they usually did not own land and had to make payments to or were in an employment position towards a landlord. The hacienda system. Most Latin American countries saw one or more extensive land reforms in the 20th century. The land reforms of Latin America were more comprehensive initiative that redistributed lands from large landholders to former peasants, farm workers, and tenant farmers. Hence, many campesinos in Latin America today are closer smallholders who own their land and do not pay rent to a landlord, rather than peasants who do not own land. The Catholic bishops of Paraguay have asserted that every campesino has a natural right to possess a reasonable allotment of land where he can establish his home, work for the subsistence of his family, and a secure life. Historiography in medieval Europe's society was theorized as being organized into three estates: those who work, those who pray, and those who fight. The Annales school of 20th century French historians emphasized the importance of peasants. Its leader, Fernand Braudel, devoted the first volume, called The Structures of Everyday Life, of his major work, Civilization and Capitalism, 15th century to the largely silent and invisible world that existed below the market economy. Other research in the field of peasant studies was promoted by Florian Zenoitsky and Faiyi Xiaotong, and in the post-1945 studies of the Great Tradition and the Little Tradition in the work of Robert Redfield. In the 1960s, anthropologists and historians began to rethink the role of peasant revolt in world history and in their own disciplines. Peasant revolution was seen as a third world response to capitalism and imperialism. The anthropologist Eric Wolf, for instance, drew on the work of earlier scholars in the Marxist tradition such as Daniel Thorner, who saw the rural population as a key element in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Wolf and a group of scholars criticized both Marx and the field of modernization. Theorists for treating peasants as lacking the ability to take action. James C. Scott's field observations in Malaysia convinced him that villagers were active participants in their local politics, even though they were forced to use indirect methods. Many of these activist scholars looked back to the peasant movement in India and to the theories of the revolution in China led by Mao Zedong, starting in the 1920s. The anthropologist Myron Cohen, however, asked why the rural population in China were called peasants rather than farmers, a distinction he called political rather than scientific. One important outlet for their scholarly work and theory was the Journal of Peasant Studies. The daily battle hunger, disease, and duty hunger gnawed daily. Meals were simple: porridge, pottage, root vegetables, or occasional salted meat. Ale was safer than water. Heavy at the time, nutritious in hindsight, but insufficient. Famine, plague, and forced labourist, especially after 1347's Black Death pushed peasants to the breaking point. Pottage, ale, and empty stomachs. The harsh reality of medieval peasant food imagined being so hungry you'd eat bread filled with sawdust and tree bark. It's hard to imagine in a world where we have supermarkets full of every type of food imaginable, Uber Eats, and Michelin-starred restaurants. But in the Middle Ages, if you weren't lucky enough to be born into nobility, meals weren't the delicious affair we're used to. They were scraps of food that had probably been boiled for a week in a big pot over the fire. This was medieval peasant food. Peasants didn't stress over what to cook that evening because of all the choices when they Googled chicken recipes. Quite the opposite. They stressed over how they were going to find something to cook that night, as the cupboards were mostly bare. Water was contaminated, so they drank watered-down ale, if they were lucky. Fruit was a luxury, and a spice cupboard didn't exist. The food was bland, boring, and came in very small quantities. So, how on earth did one survive as a medieval peasant? Good question. And one we're about to get the answer to. A hard life on an empty stomach. Imagine waking up at the crack of dawn, not to the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and croissants, but to the grumble of an empty stomach and the day's labour looming ahead. For medieval peasants, this was the norm. Life was a relentless cycle of toil and hunger, with little room for comfort or indulgence. Their days were dictated by the sun, starting with tending to the fields, caring for livestock, and performing various chores essential for survival. Meals were sparse and monotonous, and water sources were frequently contaminated, making ale the safer beverage choice, even for children. The constant physical labor, combined with inadequate nutrition, meant that fatigue and malnutrition were common. Yet, despite these hardships, peasants found strength in community and resilience, sharing what little they had and supporting one another through the daily grind. Bread, but not the nice kind in the Middle Ages. Bread was the cornerstone of a peasant's diet, but it was a far cry from the artisan loaves we enjoy today. This bread was dense and coarse and often made from a mix of grains like rye, barley, and oats. Wheat, which produced finer bread, was typically reserved for the upper classes. During times of scarcity, peasants had to get creative. They supplemented their flour with fillers like acorns, peas, and even sawdust to stretch their provisions. The result was a heavy, dark loaf that was more about sustenance than flavor. Baking was often a communal affair. Villages had shared ovens where families would bring their dough to be baked. These ovens were massive, stone structures that retained heat well, allowing multiple batches to be baked in succession. Pottage, the original one-pot wonder. Picture this: a single, soot-blackened pot hanging over an open fire, its contents bubbling away with a medley of whatever the garden, forest, or larder could offer. This was pottage, the medieval peasants' go-to meal. It wasn't about recipes or culinary flair. It was about survival and making do with what was available. Pottage was a thick stew, ever-changing based on the season and the day's scavenge. Root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, and turnips formed the base, while grains such as barley or oats added heft. Occasionally, a handful of herbs or a splash of ale might find their way in, but meat was a rare luxury. This stew simmered for hours, sometimes days, with new ingredients added as they became available. It was a communal dish, feeding families and neighbors alike, embodying the resourcefulness and resilience of peasant life. Meat was for the rich in the Middle Ages. Meat was a luxury that most peasants could rarely afford. Their diets were predominantly plant-based, consisting of bread, pottage, and whatever vegetables they could grow or forage. Meat was typically reserved for the nobility and the wealthy, who had the means and legal rights to hunt game and raise livestock for consumption. Peasants occasionally consumed meat, but it was often limited to special occasions or feast days. When they did have access to meat, it was usually salted pork or dried fish, which were more affordable and had longer shelf lives. Fresh meat was a rarity and often unattainable due to cost and legal restrictions. Hunting laws were strict, and forests were often designated as royal hunting grounds. Poaching was considered a serious offense, with severe punishments including fines, imprisonment, or even death. Despite the risks, some peasants resorted to poaching to supplement their meager diets, highlighting the desperation and hunger that many faced. Whatever grew nearby, there were no grocery runs in the Middle Ages. If it didn't grow in your garden, it probably didn't end up on your plate. Peasants relied heavily on the rhythm of the seasons and the stubborn crops that could survive them. It's a bit like where I live now in rural France. Everything is seasonal. Peasants would live on cabbage, onions, turnips, leeks, and beans, which made regular appearances, not because they were loved, but because they were tough enough to grow. Most families kept a tiny plot of land for vegetables. Some even had a strip in the Lord's fields to plant what they needed. Every inch of land mattered, and wasting food wasn't an option. Wilted greens went into the pottage pot. Roots were stored in cool places to stretch into winter, and herbs were dried for when fresh ones were long gone. Beyond the garden, foraging was essential. Nettles, mushrooms, and berries all had their uses. However, foraging came with risks because some plants were toxic, and not every mushroom was friendly. Still, peasants knew their local land like the back of their weathered hands. Dairy, if you had a cow or a goat, if you were lucky enough to own a cow or a goat, or shared one with neighbors, you had a steady source of nutrition that didn't involve digging or foraging. But milk wasn't something you poured into a glass. It didn't keep, and without refrigeration, It turned fast, so peasants made use of every drop. Milk was churned into butter, curdled into cheese, or used in cooking to stretch out other ingredients. The goal was always the same: nothing wasted. Even the whey left over from cheesemaking had a purpose, poured into stews or fed to pigs. Eggs were another small luxury. A few chickens scratching around the yard could mean protein on the table without slaughtering anything. But like everything else, it was seasonal. Hens didn't lay much in winter. If times got really hard, the chickens might end up in the pot too. Farmers and peasants, food and the harvest reclaiming land. The available technology limited the size of the village. All the land its residents worked had to be within close enough walking distance for the peasant to be able to walk back and forth to his field and do a full day's work within 12 to 14 hours. In other words, most of the land that peasants farmed was within a 1-hour walk from the village, and much of it was closer. These limitations meant that a medieval village could quickly become pressed for land as its population grew, and some techniques were developed to extend a village's arable land, or at least to make it more fertile. Large-scale land reclamation in the form of dikes and other drainage projects did not occur in Europe until the 18th and 19th centuries, but certain areas, such as Flanders and the Netherlands, took steps in that direction in the later Middle Ages. It is possible to drain land by ploughing in a direction that facilitates runoff, such as on top of a ridge, and there are examples of peasants in England and France using this technique when planting fields. Ways to increase the fertility of the soil were employed more widely than such attempts at land reclamation. The traditional and least labor-intensive method was to leave a field alone for a season, that is, to let it lie fallow. Depending on their resources, peasants also amended the soil. In parts of England, marl was spread on fields. Marl is a clay soil containing a carbonate of lime, and lime increases nitrogen in the soil, accelerating plant growth. Manure mixed with straw compost could also be spread on fields. Yet, often neither marl nor compost was available in a quantity necessary for it to be effective. In other words, peasant resources for improving or expanding arable land were limited. Crops and land. Peasants used much of the arable land they controlled. Beyond that, around their residences, for growing grain, the type of grain and the method they used to plough and plant varied greatly depending on climate and tradition. The staple grain was whichever variety grew best in the region: rye in the mountains, wheat in lowlands, barley, oats, vetch, and others throughout Europe. By the 10th and 11th centuries, in most parts of Central and Western Europe, these grains were grown in rotation to maximize productivity. For example, wheat and rye were traditionally sown planted in the fall, while barley, oats, vetch, and peas were sown in the early spring. Crop rotation could occur 2 or 3 times a year, depending on the period and the region. But generally, every 2nd or 3rd year a field was left fallow to recover some fertility. By the 12th and 13th centuries, as the European economy grew, certain regions began to specialize. For example, Burgundy and Bordeaux produced wine, while around Toulouse in southern France, the peasants concentrated on growing the plants, from which blue and yellow dyes were made. Northern England was known for its sheep, while northern Germany specialized in cattle. In order to support such varied styles of agriculture, the ways peasants distributed village lands were also different. In some parts of Europe, a peasant's landholdings formed a solid block of property. But the common pattern in France, England, and Western Germany was for all the village lands to be divided into strips. Each landholding peasant had rights to a certain number of strips. and they were scattered all over the village lands. This method ensured that no single peasant household monopolized all the best land, plowing and planting. One of the great technological revolutions of the Middle Ages was the development of the moldboard plow, which allowed a farmer to plow the land more deeply than he could using an older, traditional plow, thus making his land more arable. In the areas where the traditional plow continued to be used, then there were many that general procedures were similar, depending on climate. Around the beginning of October, a farmer began to break up the soil in his fields so that it would be ready for planting. He and his son, a male relative, another farmer, or even a female family member, hitched a team of horses or oxen to the plow. While one person guided the team, the other guided the plow, and they would begin making long, straight furrows up and down their narrow strips of land. After the furrows had been made, the farmer placed his seed in a basket or bag draped across his chest and scattered the seed on the field. After all the seed had been spread, he brought the team of horses or oxen out again and attached them to a harrow, a rectangular or square metal frame with downward-facing metal spikes that raked the fields as it was pulled, leveling the furrows and covering the seed. Finally, each household in the village was responsible for planting or maintaining a certain length of hedge or border around the field so that village animals could not eat the crop. All this work needed to be completed within a month, and it was repeated again in the spring, when a new crop was sown. While grown men normally did the ploughing and planting because of the strength that was needed to use a moldboard plough, boys, as young as 7, could remove stones from the fields and chase away birds and other animals that might eat seeds or damage the crop when they were needed. Women also worked in the fields. The harvest, one of the peasants' most back-breaking and important chores, was harvesting their crops. At harvest time in particular, all members of the village turned out to lend a hand. Women and children worked alongside husbands, fathers, and brothers to bring in the crop on which they depended. A mother with an infant would put it in a carrier that was hung from a low limb so that animals could not injure or eat the child. Those villagers who did not have sufficient land for their needs, or who had no land at all, worked as laborers for other villagers. Harvesters worked their way down a field, using sickles to cut off the grain near its base. This grain was left to dry and turned with pitchforks, usually for a few days, depending on the climate. A sudden downpour could mean famine for a village. Once the grain was dry enough so that it would not rot while stored, it was gathered into bundles, sheaves, and brought back to buildings where it would be kept. The poorest peasants might end up carrying these bundles on their backs, but normally several wagons owned by the most prosperous peasants in the village were hired out to carry the grain. Once the harvest had been gathered, peasants opened the barriers around the fields, and cattle and other livestock were allowed to graze on the stubble chaff, gathering food. Peasants had other sources of food besides the grain they grew in their fields. In their tofts, they grew garden vegetables appropriate to their climate, including radishes, celery, carrots, cabbage, onions, lettuce, and spinach. They also might have a few fruit and nut-to-hand ox herds. Joba, medieval lord, prepared lists of customary rents and services that he was owed, and generally bound them together in a book known in England as a customal. The following excerpt is from the Bleeden Customal, prepared in Bleeden in southwestern England during the early 13th century. It describes the duties of an oxherd who worked on the manors of St. Swithin's Priory in Winchester. An oxherd is ordained by office to keep oxen. He feedeth and nourisheth oxen, and bringeth them to Lee's pasture and home again. and bindeth their feet with landholds and spannels types of hobbles, and knighteth and cloggeth them while they be in pasture and leas, and yoketh, and maketh them draw at the plough, and pricketh the slow with a goad, and maketh them draw even, and pleaseth them with whistling and with song, to make them bear the yoke with the better will for the liking of melody of the voice. And this herd driveth and ruleth them not only to eat, but also to tread and to thresh. And they lead them about upon corn to break the straw in threshing and treading the flour. And when the travail is done, then they unyoke them and bring them to the stall, and feed them thereat. When he fastens the cattle of the Lord in the byre in winter, he must watch over them and get the hay and straw which they must eat, and he will carry it into the byre, and he will have what is left before to oxen, which is called ought. For the whole time the oxen of the Lord are standing in the byre, and he will have his own ox fastened between 2 oxen of the Lord from Christmas Eve to noon on Ascension Day. And he will watch over the oxen and cows and the other beasts of the Lord in the byre day and night, and he will give them to eat, and will water them when it is needful. Trees, apple, pear, cherry, plum, chestnut, walnut, and almond trees are frequently mentioned in medieval documents. Peasants also brewed beer or made wine from their grain or grapes. Beer in Northern Europe and wine in Southern Europe were staple foods. Moreover, peasants had the right to gather food in the forest, which made available to them various herbs, fruits, and nuts, as well as wild mushrooms. Peasants were, however, prohibited to hunt and often not allowed to fish, and the penalties for violating these laws could be quite severe. Such regulations meant that peasant foods, especially for poorer peasants, were mostly limited to vegetables and fruits. Storing and preserving food, it is estimated that an adult man in the Middle Ages needed at least 4,500 calories a day to support his activities, a figure that is almost twice the recommended caloric intake for an average modern man. With such needs, it is not surprising that the bulk of a peasant's time was devoted to gathering and preserving food. Moreover, much of a medieval peasant's food supply was available only seasonally. Fruits and nuts were harvested when they were ripe, and certain seasons were known by what fruits appeared then. Some of whatever food was gathered needed to be kept for times of hardship, so preservation was a central problem and an important chore. Although cereals could be stored year-round in sheds, bins, or even in the rafters, there was always a chance that they would spoil or that rodents would get into them. When cereals were made into flour, they had a longer shelf life. Because beans and peas could be dried for use year-round, they were staples in a peasant diet. Peasants also preserved cow and goat milk by making it into butter and cheese. Butter was packed in salt, and the reduced water content of cheese made it keep better. When meat was available, it was salted and dried, and before it was used it had to be soaked in water several times. Meat was also a seasonal commodity because of the expense of keeping livestock through winter. November was known as butchering month, when elderly and excess livestock was killed and meat was salted. As a result of their methods of obtaining food and their means of storing it, peasants had an extremely uneven diet, with feasts and famines occurring within months of one another. Daily meals. Although peasants had access to various foodstuffs, basic peasant food was quite simple. Generally, meals were cooked over the fire in a pot into which had been put water, grains, and peas or beans. The mixture could be made more appetizing by adding herbs, other vegetables, fat, oil, or even a pinch of salt, depending on their availability and a peasant's wealth. Medieval peasants generally did not eat breakfast. Normally, the first meal was eaten between 10 a.m. and noon after. a morning's work had been accomplished. Supper was eaten in the early evening. The first meal was usually the largest, and if extra foodstuffs, such as meat, were available, they would appear on the table then. When meat was to be served, it was roasted beside the fire, and a wooden platter or container was placed under it to catch the drippings. This fat was useful in cooking and as grease for other household uses, such as softening chapped hands and oiling shoes. Beer and wine were another source of vitamins and calories for peasants, with the choice of beverage depending on region. The production of beer and wine for household use was most frequently women's work. Although by the 13th century wine production had become more commercialized, it is estimated that a medieval European drank approximately a gallon of ale or a half-gallon of wine a day, although many peasants would have probably drunk less because of the cost. The alcohol content of medieval wine and ale, however, was substantially lower than their modern equivalents. Bread was another product that became less of a luxury during the Middle Ages, but it was still less common than grain porridge because of the cost in time, materials, and expertise to produce it, because peasant homes did not contain ovens or did not have ready ways of maintaining the consistent heat necessary to produce bread. Bread was often baked at a village bakehouse, and only a fairly large and prosperous village could support one. Moreover, the danger of fire led many lords and village committees to set strict regulations on the kinds of fires allowed in peasant homes and how hearths should be maintained and used. Livestock. Aside from a peasant's house and land, his greatest investment was in livestock. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and poultry were expensive to maintain and often the first sacrificed in times of famine. The largest domesticated animals peasants used regularly were horses or oxen, which were needed to pull the heavy moldboard plough. Although medieval treatises about ploughing often called for a team of 8 horses or oxen, it seems that most peasants worked with 4 animals. Oxen were cheaper to obtain and could tolerate coarser feed, but horses did not require any more feed and did half again as much work, making horses preferred draft animals. Given the costs of such animals, peasants combined their resources to buy a team or rent one from a prosperous neighbor. One reason that horses or oxen were expensive to support was that medieval peasants rarely cultivated hay just to feed their animals. Farmers relied on that natural hay that grew near rivers and streams, or in other low, wet places, and mowed these areas when they could. It was also common to allow cattle and horses into harvested fields to eat the chaff left after harvesting, a practice that had the advantage of scattering manure, that is, fertilizer, on the fields. A town bull was allowed to run loose in the town to impregnate cows, while the ownership of this bull and rights to a percentage of its calves' value was originally a noble's privilege. By the 13th century, the village priest or a village committee also seems to have had this right. Medieval documents do not mention a town stallion, so it is not entirely clear how medieval villagers bred their horses. Small animals. Peasants often owned livestock such as pigs, goats, and poultry. Women generally tended these animals, as well as dairy cattle, and processed many of the animals' products. They clipped hair from sheep and goats to make cloth. They milked cows and churned the milk to produce butter and eggs. They collected eggs from chickens, which laid them all around the chicken yard and sometimes pecked at the egg gatherers, while many animals were kept in the farmyard around the peasant residence. Others grazed on common lands, and some escaped from their enclosures. For example, pigs and other smaller livestock ran half wild. Many villages and even cities had individuals whose job it was to turn the villagers' livestock into the woods in the morning so that pigs and other animals could fatten themselves on the nuts and plants there. At times, the livestock was gathered in the evening, but certain animals, such as pigs, might be left in the woods for weeks at a time. Peasants identified their animals by brands or by marks carved into the animal. Cats and dogs were also part of a village, more as working animals than as pets. Dogs guarded the property and helped with herding and managing the livestock. Cats killed the rodents that tended to live in thatched roofs and got into the grain supply. Sources: Robert Fassier, Peasant Life in the Medieval West, translated by Juliet Vale, Oxford and New York, Blackwell, 1988, closing parenthesis. Agriculture in the Middle Ages, Docriculture in the Middle Ages, describes the farming practices, crops, technology, and agricultural society and economy of Europe from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 to approximately 1500. The Middle Ages are sometimes called the Medieval Age or period. The Middle Ages are also divided into the Early, High, and Late Middle Ages. The early modern period followed the Middle Ages. Epidemics and climatic cooling caused a large decrease in the European population in the 6th century. Compared to the Roman period, agriculture in the Middle Ages in Western Europe became more focused on self-sufficiency. The feudal period began about 1000. The agricultural population under feudalism in Northern Europe was typically organized into manors consisting of several hundred or more acres of land presided over by a lord of the manor, with a Roman Catholic church and priest. Most of the people living on the manor were peasant farmers or serfs who grew crops for themselves, and either labored for the lord and church or paid rent for their land. Barley and wheat were the most important crops in most European regions. Oats and rye were also grown, along with a variety of vegetables and fruits. Oxen and horses were used as draft animals. Sheep were raised for wool and pigs were raised for meat. Crop failures due to bad weather were frequent throughout the Middle Ages, and famine was often the result. The medieval system of agriculture began to break down in the 14th century with the development of more intensive agricultural methods in the Low Countries and after the population losses of the Black Death in 1347 to 1351 made more land available to a diminished number of farmers. Medieval farming practices, however, continued with little change in the Slavic regions and some other areas until the mid-19th century. 3 events set the stage and would influence agriculture for centuries in Europe. First was the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which began to lose territory to foreign barbarian invaders about the year 400. The last Western Roman emperor abdicated in 476. Thereafter, the lands and people of the former Western Roman Empire would be divided among different ethnic groups, whose rule was often ephemeral and constantly in flux. Unifying factors of Europe included the gradual adoption of the Christian religion by most Europeans, and in Western Europe, the use of Latin as a common language of international communication, scholarship, and science. Greek had a similar status in the Eastern Roman Empire. Secondly was an era of global cooling which started in 536 and ended about 660. The cooling was caused by volcanic eruptions in 536, 540, and 547. The Byzantine historian Procopius said that the sun put forth its light without brightness. Summer temperatures in Europe dropped as much as 2.5 say 4.5 F, and the sky was dimmed from volcanic dust in the atmosphere for 18 months, sufficient to cause crop failures and famine. temperatures remained lower than the preceding Roman period for more than 100 years. The late antique Little Ice Age preceded and may have influenced a number of disruptive events, including pandemics, human migration, and political turmoil. Third was the plague of Justinian, which began in 541, spread throughout Europe, and recurred periodically until 750. The plague may have killed up to 25% of the people of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire and a similar percentage in Western and Northern Europe. The double impact on the population of climatic cooling and the plague led to reduced harvests of grain. John of Ephesus's account of travel through rural areas speaks of crops of wheat, white and standing, but there was no one to reap them, and store the wheat, and vineyards, whose picking season came and went with nobody to pick and press the grapes. John also speaks of the severe winter, presumably caused by volcanic dust. The consequence of these factors was that the population of Europe was substantially less in 600 than it had been in 500. The estimate of one scholar was that the population on the Italian peninsula decreased from 11 million in 500 to 8 million in 600 and remained at that level for nearly 300 years. The declines in the population of other parts of Europe were probably of similar magnitude. The early Middle Ages, the popular view is that the fall of the Western Roman Empire caused what Petrarch would later call Dark Ages in Western Europe, in which notionally knowledge and civility, the arts of elegance, and many of the useful arts were neglected or lost. Conversely, however, the lot of the farmers, who made at least 80% of the total population, may have improved in the aftermath of the Roman Empire. The fall of Rome saw the shrinking of tax burdens, weakening of the aristocracy, and consequently greater freedom for peasants. The countryside of the Roman Empire was dotted with villas or estates, characterized by Pliny the Elder as the ruin of Italy. The estates were owned by wealthy aristocrats and worked in part by slaves. More than 1,500 villas are known to have existed in England alone. With the fall of Rome, the villas were abandoned or transformed into utilitarian, rather than elite, uses. In Western Europe, then, we seem to see the effect of a release from the pressure of the Roman imperial market, army and taxation, and a return to farming based more on local needs. The population declines of the 6th century, and, thus, a shortage of labor may have facilitated greater freedom among rural people who were either slaves or had been bound to the land under Roman law. The Eastern Roman Empire. Early in the Middle Ages, the agricultural history of the Eastern Roman Empire differed from that of Western Europe. The 5th and 6th centuries saw an expansion of market-oriented and industrial farming, especially of olive oil and wine, and the adoption of new technology such as oil and wine presses. The settlement patterns in the East were also different than the West. Rather than the villas of the Roman Empire in the West, the farmers of the East lived in villages which continued to exist and even expand. Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula seems to have had a different experience than Eastern and Western Europe. There is evidence of abandonment of farmland and reforestation due to depopulation, but also evidence of expanded grazing and livestock raising of horses, mules, and donkeys. The economy of the Iberian Peninsula seems to have become disconnected from the rest of Europe, and, instead, it became a major trading partner of North Africa in the 5th century, long before the Umayyad conquest of the peninsula in 711. Agriculture in Iberian, what historian Andrew Watson called the Arab Agricultural Revolution, The Arab-Muslim rulers of much of Al-Andalus 8th through the 15th centuries introduced or popularized a large number of new crops and new agricultural technology into the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and Portugal. The crops introduced by the Arabs included sugarcane, rice, hard wheat, durum, citrus, cotton, and figs. Many of these crops required sophisticated methods of irrigation, water management, and agricultural technologies such as crop rotation, management of pests, and fertilizing crops by natural means. Some scholars have questioned how much of the Arab or Muslim agricultural revolution was unique, and how much was a revival and expansion of technology developed in the Middle East during the centuries of Roman rule. Whether credit of invention belongs mostly to the people of the Middle East during the Roman Empire or to the arrival of the Arabs. The Iberian landscape changed profoundly beginning in the 8th century. Feudalism, gradually, the Roman system of villas and agricultural estates, using partly slave labor, was replaced by manorialism and serfdom. Historian Peter Saris has identified the characteristics of feudal society in 6th century Italy, and even earlier in the Byzantine Empire and Egypt. One of the differences between the villa and medieval manor was that the agriculture of the villa was commercially oriented and specialized, while the manor was directed towards self-sufficiency. Slavery was important for the agricultural labor force of the Roman Empire, and died out in Western Europe by 1100. The slaves of the Roman Empire were property, like livestock, with no rights of personhood, and could be sold or traded at the will of his owner. Similarly, the serf was tied to the land and could not leave his servitude, but his tenure on the land was secure. If the manor changed owners, the serfs remained on the land. Serfs had limited rights to property, although their freedom of movement was limited, and they owed labor or rent to their lord. Feudalism was in full flower for most of northern Europe by 1000, and its heartland was the rich agricultural lands in the Seine Valley of France and the Thames Valley of England. The medieval population was divided into three groups: those who pray clergy, those who fight knights, soldiers, aristocrats, and those who work peasants. The serf and farmer supported with labor and taxes the clergy who prayed and the noble lords, knights, and warriors who fought. In return, the farmer received the services of the church and protection by mounted and heavily armored soldiers. The church took its tithe, and the soldiers required a large economic investment. A social and legal gulf resulted between the priest, the knight, and the farmer. Moreover, with the end of the Carolingian Empire 800 to 888, the power of kings declined and the central authority was little felt. Thus, the European countryside became a patchwork of small, semi-autonomous fiefdoms of lords and clergy ruling over a populace mostly of farmers, some relatively prosperous, some possessing land, and some landless. A major factor contributing to the death of feudalism in most of Europe was the Black Death of 1347 to 1351 and subsequent epidemics which killed 1/3 or more of the people of Europe. In the aftermath of the Black Death, land was abundant and labor was scarce, and the rigid relationships among farmers, the church, and the nobility changed. Feudalism is generally regarded as having ended in Western Europe around 1500, although serfs were not finally freed in Russia until 1861. The manor, agricultural land in the Middle Ages under feudalism, was usually organized in manors. The medieval manor consisted of several hundred or sometimes 1,000 acres of land. A large manor house served as the home or part-time home of the lord of the manor. Some manors were under the authority of bishops or abbots of the Catholic Church. Some lords owned more than one manor, and the church controlled large areas, within the lands of a manor, a parish church, and a nucleated village. Housing the farmers was usually near the manor house. The manor house, church, and village was surrounded by cultivated and fallow land, woods, and pasture. Some of the land was the domain of the Lord. Some was allocated to individual farmers, and some to the parish priest. Some of the woods and pasture were held in common and used for grazing and wood gathering. Most manors had a mill for grinding grain into flour and an oven to bake bread. The field systems in medieval Europe included the open field system, so called because there were no barriers between fields belonging to different farmers. The landscape was one of long and uncluttered views. In its archetypal form, cultivated land consisted of long, narrow strips of land in a distinctive ridge and furrow pattern. Individual farmers owned or farmed several different strips of land scattered around the farming area. The reason for farmers possessing scattered strips of land was apparently to reduce risk. If the crop in one strip failed, it might thrive in another strip. The lord of the manor also had strips of land scattered around the fields, as did the parish priest, for the upkeep of the church. The open field system required cooperation among the residents of the community and with the lord and the priest. Strips of land were cultivated individually, yet were subject to communal rotations and typically communal regulation of cropping. Two patterns of cultivation were typical of the open field system. In the first, the arable land was divided into two fields. One half was cultivated and the other one was left fallow every year. Crops were rotated between the two fields every year, with the fallow field being allowed to recover its fertility and used for livestock grazing when not dedicated to crops. The two-field system continued to be most prevalent throughout the Middle Ages in dry summer Mediterranean climates in which grain crops were planted in autumn and harvested in spring, the summer being too dry for spring-planted crops to prosper. A three-field pattern was typical of the later Middle Ages. In Northern Europe, with its wetter climate, one field was planted in autumn, one field was planted in spring, and the third field was left fallow. Crops were rotated from year to year and field to field. Thus, cultivation was more intensive than it was under the two-field pattern. In both patterns, common areas of wood and pasture, as well as fallowed fields, were used for communal grazing and wood gathering. The woods and meadows comprising common lands were open to exploitation to all farmers in the manor, but under strict management of the number of livestock allowed each farmer to avoid overgrazing. Fallow fields were treated as common lands for grazing. The open field system had a more individualistic, less communal variant, usually prevalent in less productive areas for agriculture. The strips of land cultivated by farmers were more concentrated, sometimes into a single block of land rather than scattered holdings. Crop decisions were often made by individuals or a small group of farmers rather than a whole village. An individual farmer might possess not only cultivated land, but woods and pastures rather than the commons of the pure open field system. Villages were often strung out along a road rather than nucleated, as in the archetypal open field system. An enclosed field system was found mostly in pastoral areas, areas of mixed farming and pasture, and more marginal farming areas. The enclosed field system was characterized by individual decision-making. Farmers typically enclosed their land with hedgerows, stones, or trees. The village church was often at a prominent location, and houses were scattered rather than collected into a village. This individualistic field system was found in eastern and southwestern England, Normandy and Brittany in France, and scattered throughout Europe. Farmers' holdings farmers were not equal in the amount of land they farmed. In a survey of 7 English counties in 1279, perhaps typical of Europe as a whole, 46% of farmers held less than 10 acres, 4 sera, which was insufficient land to support a family. Some were completely landless, or possessed only a small garden adjacent to their house. These poor farmers were often employed by richer farmers, or practiced a trade in addition to farming. 33% of farmers held about 1/2 virgate of land, 12 acres, 4.9 hectares, to 16 acres, 6.5 hectares, sufficient in most years to support a family. 20% of farmers held about a full virgate, sufficient not only to support a family, but to produce a surplus. A few farmers accumulated more than a virgate of land, and thus were relatively wealthy, although not belonging to the nobility. These rich farmers might have tenants of their own, and would hire labor to work their lands. 32% of arable land was held by the lord of the manor. The farmers of the manor were required to work for a specified number of days per year on the lord's land, or to pay rent to the lord on the land they farmed. Crops in the late Roman Empire in Europe. The most important crops were bread, wheat in Italy, and barley in northern Europe and the Balkans. Near the Mediterranean Sea, viticulture and olives were important. Rye and oats were only slowly becoming major crops. The Romans introduced viticulture to more northerly areas such as Paris and the valleys of the Moselle and Rhine rivers. Cultivation of olives in medieval France was traditional on the southeastern coast, bordering on Italy, but apparently the cultivation of olives in Languedoc on a large scale began in areas only in the 15th century. In Roman times, spelt, a kind of wheat, was the most common grain grown on the upper Danube River in Swabia, Germany, and spelt continued to be an important crop in many areas of Europe throughout medieval times. Emmer wheat was of much less importance in Swabia and most of Europe. Bread wheat was relatively unimportant in Swabia in the 8th through 11th century. In northern France, the most important crops were in approximate order rye, Sakali cereal, bread, wheat, barley, and oats, Avena, sativa. Barley and oats were the most important crops in Normandy and Brittany. Rye is more winter hardy and tolerant of poor soils than wheat, and thus became the dominant crop on many marginal and northernmost European sites. Another hardy crop, beer, a kind of barley, was grown in Scandinavia and England, and especially in marginal agricultural areas in Scotland, in the lowlands of the Netherlands and adjacent France. Soil influenced the crops planted. On sandy soils, in a 3-field system, wheat was nearly absent as a crop, with rye planted as a winter crop, and oats and barley being the principal spring-planted crops. On more fertile loess and loamy soils, wheat, including spelt, became much more important, replacing rye in many areas. Other crops included pulses, beans and peas, and fruits and vegetables. Farmers of loess and loamy soils planted a wider variety of crops than those on sandy soils. Then Wiltshire, in England, in the 13th and 14th centuries, wheat, barley, and oats were the 3 most common crops, with varying percentages of each on different manors. Legumes were planted on up to 8% of the common fields. In addition to the grain crops in the common fields of the open field system, farmers' houses usually had a small garden croft near their house in which they grew vegetables, such as cabbages, onions, peas and beans, an apple, cherry or pear tree, and raised a pig or 2 and a flock of geese. Livestock was more important in northern Europe than in the Mediterranean area, where dry weather in summer reduced the fodder available for animals. Near the Mediterranean, sheep and goats were the most important farm animals, and transhumance, seasonal movement of livestock, was common. In northern Europe, cattle, pigs, and horses were also important. Mediterranean soils were lighter than those commonly found in northern Europe, thus reducing the need of Mediterranean farmers for oxen and horses as draft animals. Cattle, especially oxen, were vital in northern Europe as draft animals. Plough teams, ideally comprising 8 oxen, were necessary to plough the heavy soils. Few farmers were wealthy enough to own a full team, and thus ploughing required cooperation and sharing of draft animals among farmers. Horses in Roman times were owned mostly by the wealthy, but they were increasingly used as draft animals. To replace oxen, after about 1000 AD, oxen were cheaper to own and maintain, but horses were faster. Pigs were the most important animals raised for meat in medieval England and other parts of northern Europe. Pigs were prolific and required little care. Sheep produced wool, skin for parchment, meat, and milk. Though less valuable in the marketplace than pigs' productivity, crop yields in the Middle Ages were extremely low compared to those of the 21st century, although probably not inferior to those in much of the Roman Empire preceding the Middle Ages and the early modern period following the Middle Ages. The most common means of calculating yield was the number of seeds harvested compared to the number of seeds planted. On several manors in Sussex, England, for example, the average yield for the years 1350 to 1399 was 4.34 seeds produced for each seed sown for wheat, 4.01 for barley, and 2.87 for oats. By contrast, wheat production in the 21st century can total 30 to 40 seeds harvested for each seed sown. Average yields of grain crops in England from 1250 to 1450 were 7 to 15 bushels per acre, 470 to 1000 kilograms per hectare. Poor years, however, might see yields drop to less than 4 bushels per acre. Yields in the 21st century, by contrast, can range upwards to 60 bushels per acre. The yields in England were probably typical for Europe in the Middle Ages. Scholars have often criticized medieval agriculture for its inefficiency and low productivity. The inertia of an established system was blamed. Everyone was forced to conform to village norms of cropping, harvesting, and building, two reputed inefficiencies of the predominant open field system, where the communal management of land, which resulted in less than optimal allocation of resources, and the fact that farmers had small, scattered strips of land to cultivate, which was wasting of time in travelling from one strip to another, despite the reputed inefficiencies. The open field system existed for roughly 1000 years over large parts of Europe, and only disappeared slowly from 1500 to 1800. Moreover, the replacement of the open field system by privately owned property was fiercely resisted by many elements of society. The brave new world of a harsher, more competitive and capitalistic society from the 16th century onward destroyed the securities and certainties of land tenure in the open field system. The Poston thesis is also cited as a factor in the low productivity of medieval agriculture. Productivity suffered because of inadequate fertilization to keep the land productive. This was due to a shortage of pasture for farm animals, and thus a shortage of nitrogen-rich manure to fertilize the arable land. Moreover, because of population growth after the 9th century, marginal lands, pasture, and woodlands were converted into arable lands, which further reduced the number of farm animals and the quantity of manure. The earliest evidence of progress in increasing productivity comes in the 14th and 15th centuries from the Low Countries of the Netherlands and Belgium, and Flanders in northern France. The agricultural practices there involved the near elimination of fallow land by planting cover crops such as vetch, beans, turnips, spurry, and broom, and high-value crops such as rapeseed, madder, and hops. As opposed to the extensive agriculture of medieval times, this new technique involved intensive cultivation of small plots of land. Techniques of intensive cultivation quickly spread to Norfolk in England, agriculturally speaking, the most advanced area of England. These advancements aside, it was the 17th century before England saw widespread increases in agricultural productivity in what was called the British Agricultural Revolution. The low level of medieval yields persisted in Russia and some other areas until the 19th century. In 1850, the average yield for grain in Russia was 600 kilograms per hectare, about 9 bushels per acre, less than one-half the yield in England and the Low Countries at that time. Famines caused by crop failures and poor crop years were an ever-present danger in medieval Europe. It was often not possible to relieve a famine in one area by importing grain from another area, as the difficulty of overland transportation caused the price of grain to double for each 50 miles it was transported. One study concluded that famines in Europe occurred on an average every 20 years between the years 750 and 950. The principal causes were extreme weather and climatic anomalies which reduced agriculture production. Warfare was not found to be a major cause of famine. A study of crop failures in Winchester, England from 1230 to 1349 found that harvest failure occurred an average of every 12 years for wheat and every 8 years for barley and oats. Localized famine may have occurred in years in which one or more crops failed. Weather was again identified as the chief cause. Climatic change may have played a part, as the Little Ice Age may have begun between 1275 and 1300, with a consequent shortening of the growing season. Warfare was apparently responsible for a major famine in Hungary from 1243 to 1245. These were the years in the aftermath of the Mongol invasion and widespread destruction. 20 to 50% of the population of Hungary is estimated to have died of hunger and war. The best known and most extensive famine of the Middle Ages was the Great Famine of 1315-1317, which actually persisted to 1322, that affected 30 million people in Northern Europe, of whom 5 to 10% died. The famine came near the end of 3 centuries of growth in population and prosperity. The causes were severe winters and rainy springs, summers and falls. Yields of crops fell by 1/3 or 1/4, and draft animals died in large numbers. The Black Death of 1347 to 1352 was more lethal, but the Great Famine was the worst natural catastrophe of the later Middle Ages. The most important technical innovation for agriculture in the Middle Ages was the widespread adoption around 1000 of the moldboard plough and its close relative, the heavy plough. These two ploughs enabled medieval farmers to exploit the fertile but heavy clay soils of northern E.